You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week, we're joined by a member of the Welsh Senedd, Lee Waters, and Dr. Jennifer Kent of the University of Sydney. They talk about how Wales has set a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit across the country and what it might take for other places to do the same. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by our super wonderful, terrific, amazing Patreon supporters. We appreciate you all for keeping the show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire going. To join this merry band of city wizards and transportation experts, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. $2 a month gets you some stickers, a handwritten note, and a cool train station stamp. $10 a month gets you one of our transportation scarves. We've got some bonus material up there, so check it out if you haven't already at patreon.com/theoverheadwire. And speaking of scarves, I've got to talking to our supplier, so hopefully the bike-only scarves in the heavyweight version will be back in stock soon. I'm also going to make a concerted effort to put together some new designs. Maybe we'll have a vote to see which one you all like best. Maybe it'll go on Patreon. Stay tuned. If you want to get one of the best scarves or the lightweight bike scarves we have now in stock, visit theoverheadwire.com. And if you'd like to support the show in other ways, you can buy books at the bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire, or find our Cars Are Cholesterol merch at bit.ly/carsarecholesterol. For anything else, you can find it at theoverheadwire.com. And definitely sign up for our 20-year-old newsletter, almost 20 years old. Or you can keep just listening and enjoying this show. We appreciate it. You can also find us on Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Flickr, YouTube, Substack, LinkedIn, or wherever you find your podcasts, of course, if you want to connect. We got some great stuff coming up the pipe, so keep listening. Lee Waters and Jennifer Kent, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for being here. Before we get started, Jen's an old hand here at Talking Headways. We've had her on a couple of times, but Lee, maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, so I'm a politician in Wales, in the United Kingdom. I've been elected for 9 years, I think. And before that, I've done a bunch of things. I was to run a small policy think tank. I worked for a sustainable transport charity called Sustrans, which is, I suppose, where a lot of my thinking developed. And before that, I was a journalist, a political reporter in the House of Commons in Westminster and in Wales.
And Jen, maybe if you can give folks a quick backgrounder, although we have had you on episode 342 and 422, if folks want to go back and listen to those. But if you could give us some basic stuff, that'd be great.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. It's great to be back here. So my name's Jennifer Kent. I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Sydney in Australia. My research is all about the links between transport, urban planning and health. And my big focus is on families and transport, trying to make parenting a little bit less car dependent.
So I do want to chat with you all about travel speeds and specifically Wales's implementation of 20 miles per hour nationally. But first, I want to ask about Wales's transportation culture and go back in time and ask what's kind of sparked some of this thinking that led to where you all are at now.
I guess the bit I should have mentioned in my background is that I was the transport minister in the Welsh government for 5 years until about 9 months ago. A key piece of information, really, in sense of why I'm talking about this. Yeah, so Wales is a funny little country. We have 3 million people, but we're spread out. So sparsely populated, very rural, with quite small cities by international standards. So Cardiff is our capital. It's got about 300,000 people. We've got a very long, porous border with England. So lots of movements back and forth to England. Our transport links move east-west. There's very little north-south movement because the mountains are in the way. It's always said that Scotland has got the right mountains in the right place between it and England, and Wales has got the mountains in the wrong place. We divide ourselves between north and south. So that's our geography, and we've become very car dependent. And also, because we are poor, we're one of the poorest parts of Europe. Our economy has been in decline for 100 years. We're bigs of coal and iron and steel economy, which obviously has been in decline. We've got ourselves addicted in the idea that the way we get ourselves out of poverty, the way we deliver economic development is through roads-based policy. Even though, we have spent hundreds of millions on lots of roads over the last 30 to 40 years, and we've become poorer. People don't seem to have put those two facts together, but it's still a very heavy part of our thinking that, we want to get agglomeration development, we want strong road links into England and between the cities, and that's where our focus should be, and our public transport system has become quite poor.
It's interesting because when I was reading over all the policies and the things that you all put together, you all are very forward on things like climate change. And that's kind of behind a number of the thinking as well. Not just economic development, but the fact that, the climate's changing. And as we found out in the last couple of weeks here in California, that's really, devastating, and we don't want it to get even worse. That's part of the thinking behind kind of moving in this direction.
Yeah, I used to say when I used to run a think tank that if an alien came from space and landed in Wales and to find out about us, read our policy documents, they think that we're the amazing progressive country because our policies say all the right things. But the practice reality is much more complex than that. But for sure, the reforms that I've been driving have been heavily based in the framing of how do we get ourselves onto a more sustainable footprint. And we've had some sort of trailblazing pieces of legislation. We passed something called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which puts in law a requirement to think long-term and to collaborate and to think about the children who have not yet been born. What kind of Wales are we creating for them? So we've got some progressive framing. We've got the usual net zero climate targets. And the one thing we have done, which has been very useful to concentrate the minds in policy debates, is set 5-year carbon budgets. Because obviously you're not going to get to net zero in the last 10 years. You've got to build up to that. And once you break down that trajectory into 5-year chunks, it makes you realize how sharp the reduction in emissions needs to be in the next 5 years, the next 10 years especially. And also, transport has been the one bit that's been let off the hook when it comes to carbon emissions. It's the slowest moving of all the sectors. And so my argument within government has been, if we are sincere about net zero, and I think there's still a question mark around the world about that, then we cannot achieve it unless we change the way we do transport. And there's no point saying we're going to do that in 20 years. We're going to do that now. And also, we cannot rely solely on electric vehicles to get us onto that pathway, which is the standard response, because it's easier. It doesn't challenge our car dependency. So we have to decarbonize for sure, but we also simultaneously have to reduce car journeys, and we have to shift modes from car to active travel and to public transport.
And Jen, I have a question for you too. I'm interested in what brought you to looking at all of the policies and programs that Wales has been getting themselves up to. It's interesting to think about the juxtaposition of not just the United States and Wales, but also Australia, which is very similar, I feel like, to the United States from a car culture perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, I just think you can't look at changing travel behaviour without looking at the policy and political context. So I've been trying to extend my research into looking at some of the structural embeddedness of the automobile in the way that politicians, responding to their constituency, obviously, think about mode shift. So that's why I've been very, very interested in what Lee's been doing. In my research, it's all framed at the moment around, as I said, getting families out of cars. And I've got 2 themes that I'm looking at, and that's getting families to travel less more generally. So looking at why we have all these overscheduled children that need to be driven around Saturday mornings for sport consistently, and also getting people to travel differently. And that's where Lee's work has just been such an inspiration to me, really. He visited Australia back in, I think it was August. And, they're so forward thinking in terms of really getting the political clout behind some of the decision making that we know needs to happen. And I guess similar to the US here in Australia, our politicians just don't have that kind of bravery. They're not courageous like that. And so I'm really interested in the different environment and structures that were going on when some of those more forward-thinking decisions were made.
And I just respond to that because I think it's important we don't set barriers that are too hard to leap. And if we're going to wait for the politics to be perfect, then we're never going to change. And there's always a danger when you look at comparators, particularly international ones, where it's easy to say, but we're not like that. X country is not like that, and therefore that lets you off the hook. And actually, the thing about politics is it's very fluid and it changes. So you're always looking for this Overton window when you can seize the moment. And actually, our politics has changed in the last year quite a lot. So the progressive circumstances I was able to seize are no longer there. The changes I've put in place, I hope, are resilient and are able to withstand changes in politics to a large degree. But the point I'm making is, from a politician's point of view, there will sometimes be an opening, and seize that opening. Don't wait for the perfect conditions. And even if you were in a political context which doesn't seem terribly promising, there are still gains that can be made.
It's interesting from reading some of the interviews that you've done too, and especially on the 20 mile per hour changes, that, this is something that we have analysis paralysis here in the United States, where we sit there and talk about stuff for years and years and years. And then, the time may have passed where the implementation could have actually happened. But with the 20 miles per hour, you could have consulted with folks locally forever and ever and ever, and then never opened it. But you're just like, well, at some point we just need to open it. And the same thing happened here in the United States recently in New York City, where, we had congestion pricing finally run past the post. And it's like, we just got to start somewhere. There's so many 4,000 page environmental documents you can build before you just got to try it out and see if it works.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. We did take some time over it. We took about 4 years from beginning to end to try and design the implementation. The thing I was particularly keen on is, in Wales, local government is very important because they, at the sharp end, they deliver the stuff. So I wanted to make sure that whatever we came up with was going to work on the ground. And so we spent quite a lot of time in trying to get the key sort of stakeholders in the same place of agreeing a practical route map for bringing about change. And though the change has been bumpy, it's been, from an implementation point of view, pretty successful. The stats are very encouraging. We don't yet have a full year's data. We've got 9 months of data, but we can see that casualties have fallen by 28%. And we've got particular gains on the higher speed. So the average speeds have all come down, but the fast speeds have come down the most. So before, the average speed, our speed limit was 30 mile an hour, and people were doing on average in the mid-30s. Now the speed limit is 20 mile an hour. People are doing on average the mid-20s. So it's not 100% compliance, but the quantum is down significantly. And just from a physics point of view, the safety impact of that less kinetic energy in the urban environment has a profound effect on the casualty stats. So even though there's been a lot of cultural resistance and a lot of political pushback, and a lot of noise in the system, the stats are pretty robust.
If we go back in time and look at how we got to the point where you all were reducing the speed limit, what were some of the steps that led to that? I mean, there's the roads review, there's looking at the policies that led to that as well. We talked a little bit about climate change. I'm wondering kind of what the steps were to get to that point and why, it led to a reduction in the speed limit across the country.
Well, the journey really was a political one. We had a new leader, a new first minister. He had a progressive package of policies, and road safety was part of that. And then putting us on a climate trajectory to get us to net zero was another part of that. There wasn't particular strong read across with those at the beginning. And I was charged with trying to implement them. So we did a number of things, and we did them all at once, if you like. So the overall framing was about getting us onto our net zero trajectory. And that meant looking at what the drivers for carbon emission increases were. And we had, as in lots of countries, a long pipeline of road schemes in development constantly. So if you're an incoming transport minister, these schemes take 7-8 years to develop. And by the time a transport minister sits at that desk, the pipeline is full. Money is committed, stakeholder expectation is set, and these schemes just keep coming, and you can't stop them. All you have to influence is what happens for the next round of development for 7 years hence. And so I was quite keen to disrupt that and say, we need to pause here. There's no way we're going to meet these carbon budgets if we just keep doing what we've always done. So we need to stop what we're doing. And we cancelled a big motorway scheme, which was controversial. And then we said, all schemes in development where there aren't shovels in the ground, we're going to stop, and we're going to review that pipeline against our carbon targets. And so we had 50 schemes in the works, and all but 15 of them were cancelled because they were seen by an independent panel we set up under Lynn Sloman, the roads review panel, judged that they were not consistent with our carbon targets. And of the 15 that remained, most of those were changed quite considerably to reduce their carbon impact, to reduce the embodied or the embedded carbon, but also to build in modal shift into those designs. So to reduce speed, to build in active travel links, to build in bus lanes and infrastructure. So we did a job of work on the road side. We brought in a big package of public transport reform. So we've been building a metro around our capital. It was ongoing. But the missing piece was bus reform. So we've been working through the system to create a far more planned and integrated bus system, and that's well advanced. We have in law, from a campaign I led before I came into politics, a piece of legislation called the Active Travel Act, which creates a legal responsibility on all highway authorities across the country to develop and maintain a network of routes for walking and cycling. So at multiple points on the different transport modes, we had reform agendas for each of them. And then the speed argument was treated separately, but there's a huge read across with active travel in particular, because we know one of the main barriers to people cycling and walking more is a fear of the road and the fear of being hit. And so reducing speeds had a big benefit for clean air and for physical activity, and also obviously for reducing road deaths. So it's quite a complicated political messaging, really, because which one of those you major on? And we majored on the road safety element, not least because, there's been a lot of cultural political pushback on all this. We are being portrayed by our opponents as being anti-car, anti-motorists, damaging the economy. So I think it was important that we frame these things in different ways and try and seize on the benefits that have the greatest political traction, I guess. So tackling the speed limit was an important way we did that. And I think there were two features, I think, of the way we've done it in Wales, which are interesting to audiences outside of Wales. And the first is we took a default approach. So we didn't say you can look at roads on a case-by-case basis and the burden of proof is to show why should you bring speeds down. We turned that on its head. We said we're going to drop the speed limit everywhere in areas where people and traffic mix. So in all residential areas, around shops, around health facilities, around community centres, using the Stockholm Declaration definition of people and traffic mixing, we said all those areas are going to drop currently from 30 to 20 unless the local authority decides to make an exception. So the burden of proof was shifted. It was not to say, where's the case for 20? It was to say, 20 is the starting point. You make a case for 30. And that, I think, has been the boldest approach that we've done, which I think is interesting to others who take different approaches. And then the second big difference we did, and this really struck me when I was in Australia with Jen, is that the argument there is you can only reduce speeds after you've changed the infrastructure. So until you change the character of the local road, only then can you look at speed. And we didn't do that. We've made no infrastructure changes at all to our roads. We've said we'll simply drop the speed. And if after dropping the speed there are still difficulties, there are collision black spots, then we'll look at infrastructure changes to lock that in. So we're doing it the other way around, because as soon as you say you must make the infrastructure changes first, you create a huge financial barrier to being able to do it, because it is so expensive to do anything on the highway that in practice it kills off progress. So we've sort of liberated ourselves from that framing, and I think that's been very powerful. So I definitely recommend that to reformers elsewhere.
Jen, I'm curious about some of the thinking in Australia. I mean, I know that here in the US, there's also one of the things that people say, especially for when you try to make big changes like congestion pricing or even just, lower the speed limits, is we need the infrastructure first. So it's kind of like, it's what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Do we reduce the speed limits, or do we have to build in all the transport infrastructure, crossings, or we need better bus system? Or, a lot of that is actually feels like, I don't want to say NIMBYism, but just like opposition to change. But I'm curious about the Australian experience on this too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's just purely a really convenient distraction and point of procrastination for actual action. And what I think it represents is, at the bottom of it, in Wales, they wanted change, and Lee wanted change, and he found a way to overcome some of the key barriers that are consistently just thrown up to actually making the road system a safer and healthier, more sustainable system. And I think that's at the heart of it. In Australia, we are really struggling to confront, I think there's a lot of cultural resistance to getting away from the automobile as, the way you travel. You have a right to travel by car. And so we're really struggling both politically and I think institutionally with this idea that you can actually confront that we need to. And I think it's similar in the US. So at the heart of it is this failure to have that desire to confront the automobile. And it's something that I'm really interested in, actually, is the way that these policy proposals land in that cultural context is just such an interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, we have very different cultural traits in Australia, in Wales, in the US, but particularly with, European, Scandinavian countries where there's more emphasis on the individual. There's less emphasis on community as the cornerstone of what we're doing as a society. And so when you get those conditions, it's really hard to push forward with these tricky political proposals. But at the soul of it, it has to be this want to change the system. I would say, Lee, fairly passionate kind of desire that you know what is the right thing to do and you find the way to do it.
I do think that the role of leadership is underplayed in a lot of the debate, really, about how to bring about transport change, because we do have such set narratives about the role of transport in our economy and society. And it feels kind of inevitable that we will keep to deepen our car dependency. And I guess particularly in the US and in Australia, there's the issue of the size. And particularly I was struck in my conversation in Australia, it's an unchallenged fact in the debate that people need to make long journeys, and therefore the only practical modes of transport are flying and long distance driving. And actually, this is it's almost a data-free conversation because, and the data isn't there in a lot of depth in Australia, which is a telling point in itself. But I'm willing to bet, because this is true around the world, that most people's journeys are not long distance business commutes. They are everyday journeys. And most people make short journeys. Even in large countries, most of the journeys people make are not those hard to change journeys. They are relatively easy to change where there are alternatives and where you put incentives and disincentives into place. But that's not what the narrative is. The narrative has been dominated by the business debate, by the long distance commute debate. And because we've got this econometric framing on transport in particular, the focus is always based on the formulas and the cost-benefit assessments that are used by the economists, which are all about journey time savings and commute journeys. And they completely underplay the leisure and the personal journeys, even though that's what makes up the majority of journeys. And so from the beginning, you've lost the argument because the argument becomes a business commute one, even though that's not what most journeys are. And those are probably the hardest journeys to shift because they are the most complicated. So, I think what we need to do is go back to first principles and say, what are the easiest journeys to change? Let's not start with what I've got, the example I like to give is, I got to pick my granny up from the hospital and pick up a bag of cement on the way home. Now, that's going to be impossible on bike or by public transport under almost all conceivable circumstances. So let's not start with that because that's a tiny, tiny, tiny minority of the sort of journeys people make. Let's start with, okay, which journeys could we shift if we really wanted to? And there are piles of journeys we could shift if we really wanted to. But that's not where the political economic debate focuses on. And so we've kind of lost the argument before we've begun it.
How hard is it too when you have it makes it easy political opposition when you can just go against something, there's a silent majority and there's a very, very vocal minority?
Yeah, and that's really what's come to bite us, really, frankly, in Wales. With cancelling so many road schemes, there was opposition, but it was manageable. The big, more challenging opposition has come around speed limits. And, this whole idea of motor normativity. And Jen and I have been discussing this, and I think she's doing work of her own on this in Australia at the moment. There's work that's come from Wales. Professor Ian Walker at Swansea University has done a lot of the leading on this. And this idea that we are so conditioned for our norms around car dependency that we've come to treat the adverse consequences of a car-centric approach in a different way to treat any other risks in our lives. And I think that psychology is fascinating and it permeates the mainstream thinking. And whenever you try and do something which can be perceived as a threat to people's freedom and mobility, it's kind of the third rail, if you like, in the American phrase of politics. It becomes very charged and very difficult and very easy to attack. And so by reducing speed limits in built-up areas, we really have antagonized a lot of people. We're a country of 3 million people, 500,000 people signed a petition against this within the first 2 weeks of the speed limit changing. And it galvanized political opponents around it. Even though these were a minority, a sizable minority and a very vocal minority, they were still a minority, but they absolutely dominated the debate. And thankfully, we've held our nerve, and the data is doing what we suspected the data would do, which is what is done everywhere else this has been tried, is that speeds come down, and as speeds come down, casualties and deaths come down. But you have to have the political will and the nerve to see through that significant pushback that you do get, and that's not easy.
Jen, can you let folks know a little bit more about motor normativity and what that means? I mean, there's been research around the world on this, but it's really interesting what this means and where people are coming from when they're in opposition. And it might not necessarily mean that they're in a regular norm on other subjects that they would be related to the car.
Yeah, absolutely. So as Lee said, the motor normativity survey was first developed by Ian Walker and a team from Swansea and Bath universities. It's basically just a series of questions that enable us to understand how people have these default, really quite subconscious preferences towards the automobile. And a big component of it, as Lee said, is this underestimation or misunderstanding of the risk that is embedded in car driving. And what Walker and his team have suggested is that this is a subconscious normative bias that exists in societies where cars dominate. Here in Australia, we're developing a survey which is going to further validate and test that scale. And what I'm really interested in is how that relates to other indices of cultural bias and indices of national cultural bias as well. So what I'm wondering is whether motor normativity is almost like a proxy for individualism, for lack of respect for authority, for this prioritization of individual freedom over the collective and so forth. And I want to be able to understand the way that that has become inbuilt into our, structures, the structures of our cities, and becomes so difficult to undo over time because, retrofitting a city for active public transport use is one thing, and then retrofitting a national culture or a national normative bias is another thing. And I think we're only starting to realise as researchers the way that those two things are so interlocked and so, literally cemented into the ways that our cities work. And it's really taken the transport research world by storm, this concept of motor normativity. And I really love that Lee is taking it up from a political perspective and starting to understand that. Because I think if we can unpick some of that bias and really start to understand how it differs around the world and how that is then reflected on mode share, sustainable transport uptake, etc., we can start to have a better insight of why we're finding it so difficult to shift the private car. I've even started to do some work on how this is reflected in vehicle size as well. So in Australia, we are happily, it seems, following the footsteps of the US to making a lot of our car market be around those really large twin cab utes and so forth. And I think that is one of the biggest threats that we have to transition and meeting our net zero targets. And it's just happening without us even thinking about it. And that's just another element of bias, that we feel as though we have this right to drive the biggest car that we can possibly afford rather than trying to minimise our impact in that way.
And I think it's really interesting, this whole debate of individual rights versus group rights. I think it's a really rich vein of research because I've been reflecting a lot on the journey we've been on in Wales and the way it's gone and how it could have been done better and differently. What's really interesting is that the 20 mile an hour speed limit campaign started off as quite an innocuous, community-based campaign, really. And it was popular. And, we did surveys 4 years out showing 80% public approval for reducing the speed limits. And then we were expecting that to dip as we got closer to implementation. There's something called the Goodwin curve. A guy called Phil Goodwin, who did this work based on the London congestion charge, was suggested that when things are at the abstract level, they're popular. As soon as you get toward implementation, it dips. But then as people get used to it, it starts to become more accepted again. So that's the general pattern we were expecting. But COVID happened. And again, we don't have enough research to be able to say this with any confidence, but certainly my instinct and my experience as a community politician around this is that attitudes really shifted with us. And we had a government in Wales that was different to the UK government in that we had lots of popular support during COVID for taking a precautionary approach. And people liked the fact that we were being sort of paternal and keeping people safe. We had a strong political dividend from that, as they did in New Zealand and Scotland and in other progressive countries during the pandemic. But that soured very quickly as we came out of the pandemic, and people no longer wanted governments to be telling them what to do or what was good for them. And so I think there was this spot at which these things came together, and it was bad timing in that sense. And that at the time when people were really fed up with government telling them what was best for them, we were bringing in this change, which was doing just that. Plus, they were doing it around the car, which is the most toxic of places to do it anyway. And it really did land very badly in that immediate period, which, according to the Goodwin curve, we're going to have the maximum opposition in any event. So there was a very pronounced pushback. And I do wonder if some of that was related to the post-COVID change of mood. And also, we had the debate in the UK around Brexit and leaving the EU. And what was interesting, again, some of the research around that, not unlike some of the research in America around the Trump vote. These are not simply sort of instrumental decisions. These are based in people's culture and people's views about the state, people's views about their own individual freedoms. And, it did feel to me like a lot of the people who were against 20 mile an hour were the sort of people who were supportive of Brexit. And those who were in favour of 20 mile an hour were the sort of people who supported Remain. They just had a different view of the state and collective action. So, I think there are lots of political, social, cultural, psychological things all at play here that coalesce around the car.
The politics part is really interesting. I'm also wondering about the social aspects of being inside for such a long time and kind of, marinating in social media as well. I mean, I feel like there's some of that going on too that might be part of why maybe people soured on something that they had thought was a good idea before.
Yeah, maybe. And there certainly was, a very active social media element to all of this. And I don't think, in terms of again reflecting what we did well and didn't do well, I think the two things we did poorly, which, we're always going to have a rough reception with some people on this. There's always going to be at least 20% of people who are never going to be reconciled to it. But there were two things I think we did which made it worse. And one was the lack of community level consultation on a street by street basis of what should be the exceptions. So what we said as a national government, we will set the default, and then it's for local authorities to say, in our community, we think these roads should remain 30 because that would make sense. And that wasn't done sufficiently well for a whole host of reasons, but it wasn't. And there's a real risk aversion in the local authorities about being seen to be having liability if there were collisions on those roads that they had use their discretion on. And so they'd rather sit behind a very firm set of rules because there's that culture in highway engineering in particular, which is very much a manual-based culture. And so, when you said to them, you do have discretion, that was very uncomfortable for the professions, I think. So, there's a whole rich theme to talk about in that, but just not to dwell on it for this point. So, there were definitely issues about the granular implementation of it on a community level. And also in the way we communicated it. So, we tried to do a behaviour change-based approach. We had specialists working with us to frame this in behaviour change terms. And so, the very clear advice was not to make this emotion-based. And so a lot of the arguments against lowering speed limits were emotion-based. And some of the best arguments in favour of reducing speed limits are about saving lives. And that, we could have denied ourselves a whole toolkit, really, in making that argument, because the very strong behavioural advice was, don't go there. Try and normalise it. So we had messages like a little bit slower, but a whole lot better. Which again, makes a lot of sense. And when you look at some of the sort of arguments behind it and the research behind it, it's sensible, but it's arid, it's bloodless. and it doesn't engage people emotionally. And a lot of these, back to our earlier conversation about what's going on politically underneath here, about people's identities, a lot of that is very emotional. And I think we kind of lost that emotional battle in choosing a behaviour framing for our messaging. And also, we just didn't spend enough money on it. We spent about £1 million on the communication side, which is very small. I think the total implementation costs were about £28 million and only £1 million on the comms side. And that was the completely wrong ratio of spend, really, I think. Because, back to the social media point of view, and then mainstream media, the way this was weaponized by the right-wing UK media, because this played very much into their tropes, we turned up with a knife to a gunfight in the old line. And so I think those two things in particular we were caught off guard on.
It's hard when the media doesn't quite, it's getting better here in the US with certain outlets and things like that, but it's hard when the folks that write the stories and stuff also have that windshield bias, I feel like, when there's not an understanding of the benefits. And even in New York right now, knives are out for pricing, even though after 2 weeks, we've seen some really amazing pictures from the streets of New York City. I do want to focus a little bit on the positives. I mean, obviously, this has been a good policy. The number of people killed was down 35%, serious injuries down 14%, slight injuries 31% from the time that I read about this. I've read articles recently about insurance rates going down, or people's insurance companies saying that there's been a lot less collisions going on because of the speed limit reductions. And so those are some seriously positive results of this policy.
Yeah, we have hard data now for the first 9 months of implementation, and we can say, with certainty that there have been, say, we're a small country, so 3 million people, but we know there are 489 fewer casualties in the first 9 months alone, and a 28% fall in casualties. So those are serious data. Those are lives saved, tragedy averted. But part of the problem, just in terms of the comm side of this, when you save someone's life, they don't often know you've saved their life. Sometimes they will, and we've had certainly anecdotal experience of people saying, well, I was hit, but I was hit at the car doing closer to 20, and had I been hit by the same car doing closer to 30, I would have died. But those messages are kind of lost in the noise, really, and that's what's so interesting about this. So there are definite positives, but you pocket positives and you focus on the negative. It's the nature of human psychology. And also what was very interesting is that people were intimidated by the cultural pushback. So to begin with, we had doctors and emergency departments willing to go on the record saying, this will save lives, we support this policy. And then we went back to them 6 months in to say, well, can you update us? Can you repeat that message? And they didn't want to do it because they were fearful of the environment. And we certainly had local campaigners who were sort of saying to us, well, so we deliberately tried to get positive case studies because people were coming to us with examples of, my father's life's been improved because he now doesn't feel scared to go out. The noise levels in my community are much lower. It's much more pleasant. Again, we knew the research was going to produce this, so we were expecting it. And then when it came and we had positive stories of people saying this, we said to them, please, can we use your story? And almost to a man and woman, they said, no, we don't want to go public on this. So it's fascinating, really, the degree to which the pushback of a minority drowned out the positive benefits to the majority. But over time, I was quite confident that as people got used to it, that would lessen. And, just anecdotally, people are definitely driving slower and they're getting used to driving slower. And what's really interesting, again, this is anecdotal, you do see people who go from Wales to England where the speed limit is still 30, people who don't agree with the speed limit change in Wales, but they go to England and say, oh my goodness, it feels so much faster there. It feels dangerous. So it's interesting how our norms adapt and how quickly. But, the data is strong and stable. And as long as we can hold our nerve, this is not a change anybody is calling to be reversed. For all the pushback, nobody is calling for this to be reversed. They're calling for more roads to be exempted. They're calling for, this is the classic of the perversity of human beings, is that people want the streets they live on to be slow, but the streets they drive on to not be slow. And that's, from a political point of view, is impossible. But that's the contradiction that we have to deal with.
That's the windshield perspective again, right? Where you see out your windshield and you're trying to get to where you're going. And if you're standing on the street with your daughter or son or your little one and you see somebody speeding by, you're like, I wish that speed limit was so much lower.
Yeah.
Because they go by so fast.
It just makes it a very hard problem to tackle, is the problem. And because there is political pushback, at a time when politicians are dealing with so many other difficulties around cost of living and, multiple simultaneous crises, this is an optional battle that you don't really need to have from a politician's point of view. And so, I do fear that people will look at the Welsh experience, other politicians, and think, oh, yeah, the stats are good, but there's a whole world of pain there that we don't need.
I do think it's something that we need to, I think, get better at in transport research and practitioner communities, celebrating some of those wins. Yep. I think we're so short-sighted and just on to the next thing, the next grant, the next paper, rather than looking back and thinking, and I don't want to put you in the position of the glorified politician, Lee, but I remember saying to you when you were back in Australia, that's 489 people whose lives have not been substantially impacted or, torn apart by the idea of being involved in a serious road accident. And I was saying to you, do you wake up in the morning sometimes or go to bed sometimes and think, oh my gosh, I have saved the lives of X number of people? That is something that very few people, unless you're a surgeon or a midwife or whatever, can actually say, particularly a transport planner or a transport minister. And I think that we just need to take a step back and really reflect on the impact that we can actually have in these spaces on people's actual everyday lives and, pat ourselves on the back for that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, that's not human nature though, is it?
No.
I think, I do sort of reflect on other big changes that have taken place, which are now accepted and celebrated and never questioned. So I think the two immediate ones, or three. So one, seat belts, which was hugely controversial and difficult at the time. Smoking in bars, very difficult at the time. And also with us in Wales, we've got a brilliant track record on recycling of waste. So we've got the second best levels of recycling in the world. Whereas 20 years ago, we were among the poorest performers in Europe. And now it's commonplace. If you live in Wales, you recycle instinctively. But as we did that gradually, there was pushback all along the way. And I think it's just having that confidence to just accept. You've got to build into your model that, if you're going to do these things, you have to prepare yourself. There is going to be opposition, but it is, in the grand scheme of things, transient. And back to your point at the beginning, Jeffrey, about, over-consulting, I think there's a real balance here between consulting enough and making it good enough, not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. Good enough to get over the line. Because once it's over the line, then you tend not to reverse. But sometimes you're a bit bloodied getting it over the line because it is imperfect. But I think if we waited for perfect, we'd have never done it. And even though what we've done is imperfect, and it certainly has some political collateral damage, is nonetheless now what we do. And I think that will consolidate.
Jen, you had 100 experts sign a petition asking for changes locally in Australia. What was the result of that? And why did you put that together in the first place?
Well, the main reason for putting it together was to confront that idea that we need infrastructural change before we can put forward the policy change. So even within academia, a lot of transport researchers are engineers and they like to engineer out the danger. And I think that the idea of putting that together was to put academic research behind that idea that you can change the system without actually having to invest a lot of money on infrastructural change. The results from it, I'm actually still working that out. I know that the letter has been distributed to multiple local government organisations, state government organisations, and it has made its way to the federal government. I wasn't expecting for it to be anything, for fireworks to happen from it, but it's still recorded there in history that we as an academic body are behind this idea that we don't need structural change for change to happen. And it coincided with Lee's visit, and it was just a good way to promote that visit as well to the academic community. And I think it has brought us together as transport researchers around this idea of, slower street speeds being one of the key components of a more sustainable transport system. I think it goes back a little bit to what Lee was saying about the idea of using the emotion behind this change to push forward, what we know as just good planning, what we know is just required for sustainable transport. And slower street speeds are a great way to put that forward. I know in the US at the moment, Kevin Kryzak from University of Colorado Boulder is working on this concept of emergency streets, which is a very, very different approach to what they've done in Wales. It's basically if a fatality happens within a few days, that street is changed infrastructurally to slow speeds down, as a mark of respect for what's gone on in that space. And I find that sort of pull of emotion could actually really work in the US because emotions are heightened in many other different ways. So I think getting that emotion forward and using it to push forward what we know is just good planning, it could be a good strategy for us in this space. And that letter was part of trying to do that.
I'll just two quick things to that. One is, in terms of, we discussed how car-centric our cultures are. And so this is a countercultural argument that we're making here, and you're not going to change that with a letter. It's going to take more than one initiative. This is about chipping away over time and accepting that this is an uphill battle. So I think these initiatives, you ask the question, what did it achieve? And the fact it brings people together and starts to change the framing of the conversation, that's a result. You're not immediately going to get a eureka, scales falling from the eyes moment from one initiative. You've got to keep plugging away at it. And the second thing that just came to mind listening to Jen there is just the other thing we've done on speed, back to the climate argument, is in our future roads policy. So we've cancelled a bunch of roads, and we've said we're going to have a new set of tests for when roads are the right solution to a transport problem in the future. And they will be, and we will continue to build roads, but we set the bar higher for when roads are the right thing to do, particularly from a climate lens, accepting that if we just keep on doing more, we're going to keep getting more induced demand, we're going to keep getting more embodied carbon, and that knocks us off the trajectory we need to be on. But one of the things we've said is that, because one of the arguments often for road building schemes is a safety one. There is a accident black spot, collision black spot, I think is better, and therefore we need to make the road safer. And the way we make the road safer is by allowing people to travel at high speeds more safely. So we put in grade-separated junctions, or we put in safety barriers, or we change the character of the road so people can drive faster with different sight lines and so on. And what we've said is, if there is a collision black spot, the first thing you should be doing is reducing the speed, not building more road. And that's, I think, a simple, but I think a very powerful change to the orthodox paradigm of the professions. And this idea, it's the job of highway engineers to allow people to travel safely, fast, whereas actually that needs challenging.
It's the whole kinetic energy argument over again. I know that there's folks researching here that talk about the safe systems pyramid, Kerry Watkins and David Ederer. And one of their main points is that kinetic energy that's created from driving faster really is a danger. And so if you can reduce that energy in any way possible, and, speeding reductions is one way, then you can, end up saving lives and creating less collisions.
Yeah, this whole, the whole embodied embedded carbon argument is fascinating, because that has not been part of the calculations for when you build road schemes. So, the amount of concrete, the amount of steel, the amount of materials that goes into building the infrastructure adds significantly to the overall carbon impact of a scheme. But that is not part of the calculations of the cost benefit of this. And so we've started saying, particularly when you look at the induced demand effect of increasing road capacity, which often happens on the back of these so-called safety schemes, is not only you producing a lot of carbon through building the road, you're creating extra journeys, which also then increases the amount of carbon that's consumed. And introducing the concept of counting the carbon from the build and the induced demand, also, I think, if you could get that baked into the calculations, shifts the balance of the argument and changes the nature of the discussion you have about the right transport solution to a problem.
I have one more thing to ask. What's coming up? What's the future of the program? And hopefully it stays intact, but what do you see going forward?
So in terms of the speed limit, then, we're making some changes to clarify the discretion local authorities have to issue the exceptions, because there are some roads that have inappropriately been reduced to 20 that make more sense. They just don't pass the sniff test. And I think once you lose the sniff test, you lose a lot of the credibility, I think, with compliance. So there's some small changes to be made there, but they're going to be on the margins. But I think now it's just about keeping the data coming and locking in those norms. But then in terms of the broader programme, we've got to stick to our decisions on not reverting to type of road building. And that's going to be hard to do when the focus is going to be constantly on growth, economic growth, because those ideas are still so orthodox and so embedded that the way you increase growth is by increasing traffic and building new roads. So that's holding the line on that, I think, is going to be the challenge. And then doing the thing that everybody always says is, not just disincentivize the behavior you don't want to see, but incentivize the behavior you do want to see and make it easier. My mantra has always been, you've got to make the right thing to do the easiest thing to do, because people will do what is easiest. And we've spent 70 years making it easy to jump in the car for short everyday journeys. And we have to make the alternative true. We have to make it easier to jump on a bike or jump in a bus or walk. And so changing that reality on the ground is a long-term change, but we've got to keep focused on convenience and choice. Back to the political framing of this, I think that's where, if we concede those arguments, we're dead, because the strongest pro-motoring argument is around choice. And actually, it's a false argument, because what we've done is taken away people's choice. We've forced people into car ownership because they don't have an alternative. And real choice is making our daily judgments mode agnostic, so people can genuinely make a choice how they get around rather than being forced to jump in the car. And we're a million miles from that. So I think framing it around choice and convenience, making non-car options convenient, I think is where our focus needs to be.
And Jen, where are you all headed?
Yeah, well, I'm feeling a bit insignificant in my academic ivory tower. My main focus at the moment is unpicking some of those cultural bias and, those deep-seated cultural beliefs. I'm transferring that onto motonormativity from the perspective of cultures of parenting. So I'm looking very much at the ways that cultures of parenting have changed over the last 20 years or so, and how that is, again, preferencing the private car as a way to, be a good parent today. And it all really is wrapped up in that complex ball of what it means to protect your children and give them the very best education and other experiences in their life and so forth. And that really relates to the motonormativity question that I think Lee's been dealing with in Wales. That's where I'm headed.
Awesome. We're going to put some of the documents in the show notes. Lee and Jen, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.
Thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of the Overhead Wire and appears first at Streetsblog USA. Thanks to our generous Patreon supporters for supporting this show and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. You can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Sign up for our 18-year-old daily newsletter by visiting theoverheadwire.com, or check the show notes for other cool merch and opportunities to connect. Follow along using your podcatcher of choice, but if you can't find it there, you can always find the show at its original home, usa.streetsblog.org. We'll see you next time at Talking Headways.